Hello, this is Terrence McNally. After 20 years, Biden's pullout of U.S. troops from Afghanistan is inevitably followed by the chaotic evacuations of our desperate Afghan allies and the self-serving blame games of our all-knowing U.S. pundits. Here's my 2017 conversation with Mark Danner, a voice of conscience and reason concerning war and terrorism since at least 9/11. We talk about his book Spiral, Trapped in the Forever War. Hello, I'm Terrence McNally. Welcome to the 11th newly recorded episode of Free Forum, a world that just might work, since the election of Donald Trump. I'll be joined today by Mark Danner, the author most recently of Spiral, Trapped in the Forever War. After hosting and producing this show weekly for 17 years, I stepped away from recording new live interviews. Since then, I've dug into the archives each week to stream one of the relevant earlier interviews on Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn, and podcasts of all of the interviews over many years are available to listen anytime at iTunes, Podomatic, or at my site, terrencemcnally.net. But following the election of Donald Trump, I cannot resist exploring our path forward in confronting him and his administration. On this show, we've always explored the lives, the work, and the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. Before we begin the interview with Mark, I just want to offer you a few websites for information on how to actively participate in resistance to Trump and the movement toward the healthy, progressive future we all so desperately need. And you can email me at temcnally@mac.com if you want to get these websites and more information. But here they are: indivisibleguide, oneword.com, indivisibleguide.com, OurRevolution.com, which is the organization started kind of off of the Bernie Sanders campaign, MoveOn.org, which has long been an online presence, but is now coordinating much more closely since the election with a ground game in your local community. 5calls.org, which tells you what calls are most necessary to be made at this point. Townhallproject.com, which tells you when your representatives might be holding town halls. And if you're in the state of California, couragecampaign.org. Okay? 16 years into the war on terror, we appear no closer to ending it than when we started. Of course, it's not even clear what ending it would look like. We're battling ideas or an approach to conflict, not a conventional army. And, of course, there can be no final victories in that sort of contest. Here's a quote: Donald Trump inherited a government on a permanent wartime footing, actively fighting in 6 countries: Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, and Afghanistan, using means both public and secret, including drone strikes and attacks by covert special forces, and doing so with the benefit of never-ending war powers granted by Congress. Those are the words of today's guest, Mark Danner. For many years, a staff writer at The New Yorker and a frequent contributor these days to the New York Review of Books and the New York Times Magazine, Danner teaches at UC Berkeley and Bard College, and his books include Torture and Truth, The Secret Way to War, and his latest, Spiral, Trapped in the Forever War. Welcome again, Mark Danner.
Oh, thank you, Terry. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's been a while. I can remember back in the early days of the Iraq War, in the early days of the endless war, we talked quite often when torture and all of that was in people's minds. Still, not the torture, but a lot of what was going on then still going on. New forms, it's morphed, but people are paying much less attention. As I always do, I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we talk about. So can you share with us briefly your path to the work you're doing today? And, if there's mentors or turning points in that path, that'd be great.
Well, I grew up in a small city in northern New York, Utica, New York, went to Harvard as an undergraduate, and then began work, and I guess what was the true turning point, at the New York Review of Books, where I worked for Robert Silvers, who, the late editor of the New York Review and the founder, who really was my mentor. I'm very glad you asked about that, because it's good to say publicly that I basically owe him an enormous debt of gratitude. He died in May at the age of 87, still editing the New York Review from his hospital bed. An amazing man, amazing intellectual, one of these people who isn't widely known to the general public, but has had an enormous effect on the public life of the country. And he really taught me how to edit and, to a certain extent, how to write, how to think about politics. The New York Review then has had a strong interest in human rights. If it has an ideology, I suppose that would be it.
Can I cut in for a second, Mark, and ask you two things? One, what was your original job out of college?
The job title at the New York Review is editorial assistant, although we tended to refer to it among ourselves as slaves. It was the basic entry-level publishing position where you would do photocopying and mail things to writers, mail books out, the most basic scut work. But then if you were of a mind, it was possible to learn editing, to work on some of the manuscripts, to talk to the authors. Basically, you could go as far into the upper realm of editing as you had a mind to go. And I was very fascinated by that. You also could type. One of my jobs was typing up the manuscripts that Bob had edited. So I would see his handiwork, in a pencil on the manuscript pages. And he was just a great artist when it came to reshaping manuscripts and reshaping sentences. And typing those up, I think, was my university. I learned an enormous amount working on them.
I haven't heard anyone else having described that role, but I can imagine you're seeing, what the reporter came up with, what the writer came up with, and then what the editor did with it. And as you're doing this fairly mechanical task, you're absorbing all of that.
Absolutely. And, there was never an explanation. Bob never sat down and said, well, this is what you want to do with a sentence. This is why I did this. This is why I did that. You simply looked at them. And as you're typing it, you realized how he took a convoluted sentence and made it clear, and how all of his efforts, some of them quite extensive, were aiming to bring out what the author really wanted to say and what various obstacles put in his path by bad writing and bad locution and inapt words and so on were serving as an obstacle, keeping him from saying what he wanted to say. And Bob's work really had to do with removing those obstacles. And, of course, it was kind of a masterclass in writing.
Of course. And the other thing,
very lucky.
Yeah, the other thing I'd love you to touch on was the history of the New York Review of Books. It started because I can remember looking at, I think, the interview you did with Silvers. It started because there was a strike, or what was the origin? That's
right. There was a great New York newspaper strike in 1963. And a couple of years before, or not even that long, Bob had published a piece. He was then an young editor at Harper's, and he published a piece by Elizabeth Hardwick bemoaning the state of reviewing in the United States, of criticism. And when the newspapers went on strike, a key early figure in the New York Review, Jason Epstein, very well-known editor at Random House and various other publishing houses in New York, gathered together Barbara Epstein, Elizabeth Hardwick, and Robert Lowell, who was then her husband, the poet Robert Lowell. And they decided that, if we're going to start a review and put our money where our mouth is, now is the time to do it, because the publishers are desperate to have a place to advertise their books with the New York Times not on the newsstands. And so they indeed just put together something very quickly, asked all their friends, which included Norman Mailer, Frank Kermode, various other, Stephen Spender, you name it, and they were in there. And, none of them were paid. It was just kind of this voluntary thing. But it was immediately popular, immediately took off. And within a couple of years, they were making a profit, and it's earned a profit ever since, which is your listeners should know, is completely unknown in the world of, or unheard of in the world of high-level intellectual journals. They never earn a profit. The New York Review has for four or five decades.
One thing I noticed there, by the way, was that I expected when you said the reason they felt now was the time to do it was because the readership must be hungry for it. But no, they were smart enough to know that the publishers, the advertisers must be hungry for it.
Exactly. I think they knew, they had confidence in their bones that the readers were hungry.
Right.
The question is whether it could be supported. And Jason's great perception was that the publishers were desperate to buy advertising, and that would support the review from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing for people who aren't that familiar with the New York Review of Books, I would say one of the things that I look to it for is long reads, as they say these days. And that still remains a hallmark, yes?
It does. During the Bosnian War, I did a couple of pieces for the review on the war on the Balkans. That one of them was 40,000 words,
which is a book,
which is really the length of a short book.
Yeah,
and they really don't publish pieces that long anymore, I'd say. But the average length is about 5,000 words, and sometimes they're double that. So yes, they are. Although I should hasten to add that not all pieces are that long, and they vary in length. And while many of them seem to be book reviews, many of the book reviews are actually reporting pieces. They're wonderful at kind of disguising all different genre pieces as book reviews.
Well, also one thing they'll do very often, it seems, more than you see in many book reviews, is they'll lump 2, 3, 4 books on the similar theme or subject together, and thus the, quote, reviewer gets to take on that subject in full.
Exactly. It's a kind of great way of charting the intellectual interest of a culture because, if you have 7 books on jihadism coming out at a certain moment, you could really delve into the subject of jihadism, of where it comes from, what it means, what the different intellectual analyses of it are, and from what traditions they come. So this kind of charting of the intellectual culture through the books it produces is an extremely fertile way to confront what's happening, what's going on.
Yeah, and the ways that different perspectives look at it and how they confront each other, and you get to be sort of the referee if you're the writer.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And it's been a formula that's worked exceedingly well for 50 years.
Yeah.
Which is really amazing. There's nothing quite like it.
And the other thing that strikes me is when you're born in 1963, you are born just as the American culture is changing. You are born as the Kennedy is assassinated, the civil rights movement is in full swing, and Vietnam is just beginning.
Exactly. That's true. It was during the high point of the Kennedy presidency. I think the first issue was in February of '63. So, if I'm not mistaken, so Kennedy was, 10 months before he was, or 9 months before he was assassinated. It was really kind of new frontier times. And of course, under the Kennedy administration, intellectuals had a major association with the administration in Washington. He had gone to Harvard and brought a great many of the Harvards, as LBJ would eventually call them, into his administration. So there was that kind of excitement as well.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating time to start. I completely agree.
It also reminds me what you just mentioned reminds me of the Pew poll that came out just recently that said that Trump voters actually, by a majority, believe that universities are a negative in society.
Yeah, I actually reported on the Trump campaign for the New York Review, and one fellow at a rally, in denouncing the polls that were showing Trump way behind at that point, was very angry about this kind of division in the polls between college-educated and not college-educated. And he said, it's as if, if you didn't go to college, you're not worth anything. You're ignorant. and it was fascinating hearing that side of it, this kind of denunciation of the biases of the national media in looking at education. And I think there's a lot of that among Trump voters, no question about it.
Yeah. Okay, so I interrupted you, but thank you for that tangent. So you begin at the New York Review of Books, and... Yeah,
and I worked there for almost, I think, 3.5 years, then went to Harper's as senior editor, Harper's Magazine, and from there to the New York Times, where I was an editor at the New York Times Magazine. And while I was at the New York Times, I started writing for the New Yorker and did some reporting from Haiti, did a long series of articles, 3-part series, about 80,000 words, another place that publishes long pieces for the New Yorker. And then I went to the New Yorker as a staff writer, where I was for about, I think, 12 years, 13 years. And then started teaching at Berkeley, as you mentioned, and at Bard College. And really started writing mainly for the New York Review, which I've been doing ever since.
Okay. So, how and why did you come to write Spiral, which, let me mention to folks, was completed in January 2016? So you put it to bed before the election of Donald Trump.
That's right. I had covered... in my entire writing career, I've tended to cover war and political violence. That's really one of my main subjects, although I've also written about American politics right along as well. And I had covered, as you know, and as you mentioned in your introduction, the Iraq War, which I felt from the beginning, from the first time it was mentioned as an idea, the invasion of Iraq, I felt was going to be a catastrophe. I think I came to that conviction because I'd written about places like Haiti, where the United States tried to, much smaller country, where the United States tried to work its will and consistently failed, and had these kind of unplanned consequences with the use of its power. And I've always been somewhat skeptical about the use of American power. Its military force is really a kind of blunt instrument when it's used to try to solve a political problem. And I felt that the Iraq War was going to be a prime exhibit in that history. So I covered Iraq for the New York Review and was struck as the years went on by the fact that the Iraq War had really simply continued. Most Americans, in a sense, look at things now and see a different world from that of the Iraq War. But in fact, what the United States did in invading Iraq was take a situation in which there was a terrorist threat and make it dramatically worse. And that was one of the things I wanted to write about. A second was the damage that the U.S. had done to itself by, during the so-called War on Terror, using techniques like torture, which were dramatically counterproductive. And finally, and this goes back to your introduction, it struck me that the United States, as you said, 16 years after the attacks of September 11th, 2001, was still fighting wars around the world, what might be called the wars of 9/11, and that most Americans had simply stopped paying attention. That is, these wars had become no longer news. They were simply the way things worked. And I thought that it was extremely important to point at that and try to understand it as a peculiar phenomenon, that we had stopped noticing that something we usually define as aberrant, that is, a country at war, had now become normal procedure, had now become normal life.
Right. It's what struck me, Mark, was that the Cold War sort of got that notion into a culture that you could be facing off with an adversary on a constant and consistent basis, but it was cold. these are hot wars. Whether we have troops or many troops in these nations or not, we are waging war through drones, through covert operations, through advising. People are dying, and so it's hot, and still it's not in the consciousness.
So this is true. These hot wars continue, and I think you're right that the Cold War has a significant influence here. The idea of a continuing state of emergency, which the United States essentially adopted during the Cold War, is what's going on now as well. So I think that practice, as it were, in a constant state of war is extremely relevant to what's going on now.
Let me just quote, if I may, Mark, some of the statistics you quote, so people get a sense of this. According to a 2014 report by The Nation, U.S. Special Operation Forces are deployed in more than 100 countries, roughly 60% of the nations on the planet. And since 9/11, U.S. military spending nearly doubled. The intelligence budget more than doubled. Deaths from terrorism have soared from 33,000 in 2014, which was 33,000 in 2014 was an increase of 35% over 2013, an increase of 4,000% over 2002. And in those places where the U.S. has concentrated its violent attention, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya, attacks, deaths, and terrorists rose the most. Your observations on those numbers?
Well, they're pretty conclusive. I mean, if what you, how do we judge the war on terror? That's the real question here. How do we judge whether the United States in the current wars of post 9/11 is being successful? And one way to judge it is, are the number who are dying from terrorism, is that number going up or down? Is the number of terrorist attacks going up or down? Is the number of jihadists who are committed to violently attacking the United States and Americans going up or down? And the answer, very conclusively, to all of those questions is those numbers are going up. There are 4,000% more terrorist attacks around the world. The one thing we should say is that the number of people, Americans, who are dying from terrorist attacks is not very large at all. And that's one of the peculiarities, the paradoxes of this situation, that there is an argument one could make that this problem is, in a sense, a created problem, that the U.S. is making worse around the world, even as relatively few Americans are affected by it. So that the United States is, in a sense, spreading terrorism or jihadism around the world by its own aggressive and expansionary violence. But the problem as a real problem that involves Americans and killing Americans is actually much exaggerated. I mean, that's the paradox at the heart of this, that, when Donald Trump campaigns and says we're threatened, we have to keep Muslims from entering the country, yada, yada, yada. In fact, the number of Americans who are dying is vanishingly small.
About the same as die from being struck by lightning.
That's right. That's what I was going to say. That in most of those years, the number of Americans who died from terrorist attacks within the U.S., that is, was smaller than the number struck by lightning. And if you count the number who died in the Iraq War, of course, those numbers are much larger. But these are wars that the United States has launched overseas, including an invasion of Iraq. So it's rather paradoxical that you have this continuing crisis, but arguably the answer to the crisis that the United States has brought since September 11, 2001 has made the problem dramatically worse.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, we're recording this interview on the 18th, and the budget, the projected 10-year budget has come out today, and the only thing that goes up is the military, the defense budget,
right?
And all social programs, arts programs, and so on would be aimed for cuts. Everyone knows this budget will not be passed as it was put forward, but it does tell you the mentality, at least, of the Trump administration.
Yeah, it's an amazing phenomenon that the United States now spends dramatically more on its military forces than it did at the height of the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War was a confrontation between these two superpowers who had vast million-man armies, tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. You know, it was a real military confrontation. And the United States now, when confronting these little groups of a few hundred jihadists, has a military budget that is much higher than during that confrontation with the Soviet Union. It's really a remarkable thing, and people seem not to be that interested in it.
That's
as far
right.
as I can tell.
And that other note that I think is always worth mentioning when we talk about defense is that while you have, I think, there would probably be universal, not just left, but not just right, but left and right, who would be against government waste and all of this. And if I'm not mistaken, the Defense Department is not only enormously large, dwarfing everything else, but it is impossible to be audited.
Mm-hmm. That's quite true. And the one thing that, you know, Trump promised to, you know, get in there and clean things up, and we've seen absolutely no sign whatever of that in the Defense Department. It's the one bureaucracy in Washington that's not only sacrosanct, but whose budget has been dramatically going up during a time of, retrenchment in all other departments.
Yeah. Okay, now what I want to do in terms of framing this or shaping this hour that we have is to return to Trump towards the end, and I will do my absolute best to bring it around like that. But I thought that Spiral does its contribution, its purpose, it seems to me, is to look at certainly the questions we've been raising, which is what was the original intention, stated intention of the war on terror? What has been the result? We've kind of framed that already in the big picture, but some of the things that you reveal in there with some distance, because a lot of the action, if you will, took place in the early years, and then you also you spend a fair amount of time in the book, and it's a very readable, fairly short book. Is it 250 even?
No, not even that. I think it's less than 200 pages of text.
Yeah, right. A lot of notes, and it comes in, I think, around 180 something or something. So it's
Mm-hmm.
very readable. It's just a couple of long New York Review of Books articles.
Mm-hmm.
And you then also spend a good chunk in the second half looking at Obama and contrasting his words, the things that he ran on and what he actually took on and what he actually accomplished. But let's go back to, as I think one has to, and first I will say what my reaction was on 9/11, and then we will look at the authorization for the use of military force against terrorists passed on September 14th. My reaction that day, I can remember I went like to the beach and just walked alone for a while. And my question was, have we been doing and will we do everything we can to minimize the role, the attraction, everything of terrorists? And it seemed to me that the biggest response would be to, if you asked yourself, what would make terrorists pariahs in their own community versus an attractive jihad, that you would approach it, in some sense, you'd probably have a mini Marshall Plan for the Middle East, and you'd do certain things and so on. That obviously was not the approach taken by Congress and the Bush administration. Can you talk a bit about that bill? And one of the points you make is that in speaking about that bill and the initial approach, very often in the words of Cheney, they were setting forth a policy, but they were also setting up their defense of their huge error, which was allowing the largest terrorist attack in American history.
Yeah, well, I think you make a number of very good points there. I mean, the last point I think is very interesting, which is a kind of psycho-political one, that in fact they allowed this attack to happen, and they were well aware that they had been warned about it, and probably pretty well aware that that warning would be made public at a certain point. So I think there was a determination to respond with enormous, overwhelming force, in part to wipe out the stain of having allowed the attack in the first place. And, you know, to what degree this was an actually conscious decision or not, it's hard to know. But I think that shame was a very dramatic part of the emotional constructs of the key leaders in the post-9/11 policy community. And Dick Cheney obviously was very much the key leader, as was obviously George W. Bush and Donald Rumsfeld. The question is really, to go back to a point we talked about earlier, what should the war on terror do? What do you do if you're confronted with a terrorist threat? And in a sense, there are a couple of answers. One answer is you should try to reduce the terrorist threat by reducing the number of jihadists and by reducing the attraction of the jihadist philosophy. That's one goal. And Donald Rumsfeld actually stated that at a certain point, that, you know, we have to be reducing the number of jihadists who are out there. And the second goal, which I think took precedent in the days and months after 9/11, was prevent future attacks. And in a sense, those two approaches in the hands of the Bush administration were contradictory. Mm-hmm. They took steps like not just the invasion of Afghanistan, but of course the invasion of Iraq, which were aggressive offensive steps, which they conceived of as preventing future attacks. But those steps actually worked against the second goal, which was reducing the number of jihadists. The Iraq War was an enormous boon to al-Qaeda and to all other jihadist groups. It gave rise to the Islamic State, which didn't exist before the Iraq War. It gave rise to numerous other jihadist groups. In a sense, as we look back on the 16 years since 9/11, was the single most important step taken during those years, and it dominates. You know, the reverberations of the Iraq War dominate in the Middle East to this day. So in a sense, there were these two goals, and they relied on one of them. That is the panic of preventing a so-called second wave attack really determined the policy much more than the notion of preventing an increase in the number of jihadists. And they took a lot of policies. Torture is another one, which actually had the effect of increasing dramatically the number of jihadists in the world. And the United States, in a sense, as I describe in the book, created a perpetual motion machine when it came to terrorism.
This is Terrence McNally. You're listening to my 2017 conversation with Mark Danner about his book Spiral, Trapped in the Forever War. I hadn't reread what the actual authorization for the use of military force, which basically everything that happened in Afghanistan, Iraq, and all these other countries, Yemen and so on, the drone war. This is justification. And I'm going to read for anyone who doesn't remember. This was September 18th, 2001. The authorization for use of military force empowered the president to, quote, use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the U.S. by such nations, organizations, or persons. Yet the single biggest action taken, the invasion of Iraq, clearly does not qualify. No one in Iraq planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, or harbored such organizations or persons. And as I recall, even in the lead-up to the Iraq War, that claim that Saddam Hussein had somehow, encouraged, harbored, in any way aided and abetted al-Qaeda, played distant second fiddle to the WMD claims. Both, of course, were false. The claim that Iraq or Hussein had been an ally of al-Qaeda was easier to disprove. But I mean, in looking at this, the stark reality of the very terms that were used to define that law were violated by that invasion. I hadn't even realized that. I knew the invasion was a mistake, but I hadn't realized how clearly it even violated the law used to justify it.
Well, you know, it should be said, you're quite right that the invasion does not conform to the original authorization for the use of military force. But it should be said that Congress did pass another authorization specifically for Iraq. So, in effect, I think the essential criticism about the authorization, though, is completely correct, because essentially it's a fairly limited authorization for the use of military force, which does not include most of the wars now being fought.
Right.
Because the Islamic State did not exist at that moment. It only existed it was created by the Iraq War. It basically raised its head in that first summer of the war in August, when it staged a series of suicide truck bombs in Baghdad and southern Iraq, which were very dramatic and were not then attributed to the Islamic State because the Islamic State by name wasn't known.
Right, and let me jump in 1 second, Mark. I recall Trump, in one of his more absurd claims, was the claim that Obama and Hillary Clinton had basically founded ISIS, right? When in fact,
yeah, it was completely factually incorrect.
Right, but based on reading this book and thinking about it, it seems to me Paul Bremer, by doing away with the military and all Baathists, actually probably is as close to an author of ISIS as there is.
Yeah, the irony is Bremer would be one of the midwives. Another of the midwives would be Colin Powell, who first raised Zarqawi's name when he spoke to the United Nations Security Council.
That's right.
On February 2nd, 2003. And he first talked about Zarqawi, who was, of course, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who became the founder of al-Qaeda in Iraq, what eventually became the Islamic State.
Being mentioned by Powell at the UN is a great thing for one's profile, for one's brand.
Exactly. It made him famous. It made him very famous. And of course, this guy was kind of a genius, Zarqawi. When I was, at first in Iraq, he was, there were these incredible suicide bombings, including in the so-called Ramadan offensive in October 2003. Where you had 5 suicide bombings in one day. And it was an amazing attack that kind of announced the jihadist power. And he was behind that. At that time it wasn't known. But it's since become very clear. He also was behind the suicide truck bomb that killed Sergio de Mello, the UN envoy in Iraq, and chased the UN out of Iraq. I mean, there was an incredible force that its existence was owed entirely to the Iraq invasion. And Zarqawi went to Iraq with the express purpose of starting an organization that he knew would be successful because the Americans were going to invade. So, all of this, the idea that Trump stood there and said that Obama and Clinton started the Islamic State is simply not true. It's not a factual debate.
No. It's like so many of Trump's things. It's just pulled from thin air, I'm being kind where I say where it was pulled from.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I mean the fact that ISIS. How am I saying this? Obama was nobody basically at the point at which ISIS is being born.
Yeah, Obama was at the. Was a state
senator in Illinois. Exactly.
Yeah. It is the great demonstration of, the birth of ISIS is really the great demonstration of the kind of counterproductive law of unintended consequences that has really dominated the war on terror since it began.
Right.
But the United States, there are times when you basically just do what your opponent wants.
Yep.
And that is what the United States did. The September 11th attacks were designed to spur the United States to invade Afghanistan. That was the point of the attacks. It had been the vision of Osama bin Laden that the United States would invade Afghanistan, become caught in a quagmire there, exactly as the Soviet Union had, and be destroyed. And this was the point. And the United States, in the event, did one better.
Exactly.
It invaded Iraq, which was even more useful to Osama bin Laden. And it's very hard, this is not a debatable proposition. This is what happened. And yet most Americans, they'll look at Iraq and they'll say, well, it wasn't very successful. And, but it goes way beyond not being successful, and in fact was counterproductive in the extreme.
Well, as you point out, in other words, we've asked a couple of questions here, perhaps rhetorically. One was, what should the U.S. response have been? What do you do in the face of a terrorist attack? The other is, what is their purpose? What is the terrorist purpose? What is their agenda? And one thing you point out repeatedly in the book is that when you have less power, which they obviously do, your goal, if you are really lucky and really good at it, is it's a form of jujitsu or martial arts where you get the big power and you actually use their power against them if they're foolish enough to do so. And I mean, as a thread that runs through the book, that's one of the primary ones.
Absolutely. I mean, terrorism is a strategy of the weak. It's a strategy of people who don't have an army, who don't have organized military force, who can't win on the battlefield. And they're hoping to provoke their opponent to take actions which will encourage recruitment to the terrorist cause. So if you can provoke an occupation where the Americans have their tanks riding down Baghdad neighborhoods and where they're breaking into houses and pulling out Muslim families and so on, that is a mechanism whereby you're going to encourage recruitment to the jihadist cause. And in fact, that's what the United States has done repeatedly since 9/11. It's helped its adversaries.
Yeah, and you'd have to say that the current incarnation, because as we've said, people are not paying as much attention to the drone killings or the assassinations and so on, is the Muslim ban. Right?
Absolutely.
Another version of the same thing.
The Muslim ban is, you couldn't do better. I mean, if it was designed by a jihadist, it would make sense because it's in effect a way to say we are going to politically do something that will anger Muslims and make as many of them as possible into sympathizers for the jihadists. It's dramatic. I wanted to get back for a second. You raised the question a minute ago about what the response should have been. And I think that's a very fair question because, if Dick Cheney were sitting here, he would say, well, we were attacked, 3,000 people were killed, and we had to do something. And, you weren't in the position of power, we were. And we had to, and you know what, we were able to respond in such a way that there were no large attacks on American soil after 9/11. So why weren't we successful? And I think that's a very fair question to ask. And my answer would be that the response should have been discreet. That is, it should have been targeted very, very narrowly at the people who attacked us. With, as you talked about the Marshall Plan for the Middle East, it should have come along with efforts, political efforts, to discourage jihadism and to make the United States more popular among Arab nations. And it should have involved an absolutely, to use an awful phrase, surgical attacks on those places in Afghanistan where the United States knew al-Qaeda was based. It should have been, using Cheney, of course, talked about we're going to have to fight these people on the dark side, and in that he was right. A lot of this should have been intelligence agency attacks. We shouldn't have used torture. Obviously, Guantanamo should not have been created. These things were major shooting. The United States shooting itself in the foot. We should have avoided. There's no accident that when the Obama administration came into office, the closest thing to an Obama doctrine was "Don't do stupid shit." That's what their motto was. Don't do things that are going to make it worse.
Yeah.
And in fact, though I criticize him extensively in the book for normalizing the war on terror, for making it permanent, in fact, they tried to a version of what I'm suggesting. They tried to narrow down the attacks, to lower their profiles, to end the conventional wars while increasing the intelligence wars. So, in fact, they're trying to do a version of what I'm suggesting should have been attempted originally. But by then, I would argue it was basically, in many ways, too late.
Right. Let me just, I want to leave this and move forward a bit, but the quote in the book that just got me crazy, and I have to put it in here, is Cofer Black, chief of CIA's Counterterrorism Center, speaking to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, says this: all you need to know, there was a before 9/11 and an after 9/11. After 9/11, the gloves came off. This is the Cheney doctrine, right? And this shows that it was the fault of the people before us who had their gloves on in their, Democrat liberal way, and nothing. But what's amazing about that statement is there was a before 9/11 and an after 9/11, and I can't help but notice he doesn't admit that there was a 9/11.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's one of the ironies. You've had various people in the last few years saying things like there was no attack under George W. Bush.
Yeah.
It's a remarkable thing when nearly 3,000 people died from a terrorist attack under George W. Bush. But a Republican talking point is he kept us safe, which, by the way, it's to Trump's credit that he really scoffed and laughed at that argument during the I think it was the South Carolina primary. He, of course, didn't keep us safe, needless to say. But, yes, this idea the gloves came off, which was an explanation for torture, among other things, has this subtle argument really as a subtext, which is actually the gloves were on before. If the government had more power and was tougher, the attacks wouldn't have happened. And I think that's completely untrue. It's a very self-serving, the definition of self-serving. And it implies that, in fact, there weren't laws in place to stop these attacks, that all these new techniques and torture and various other things were needed.
If only we weren't. Right, if only we'd had them then. And as you point out, none of the things that they added, none of the policies they added would have done anything to stop those attacks.
No. And in fact, the dirty little secret and the thing that they're trying to get away from and distract one from is a simple point, which is that those attacks could have been stopped if a few people in the bureaucracy and a few leaders at the top of the bureaucracy, including Cheney, including Rumsfeld, were actually paying attention. All the laws were in place to stop them. They had a lot of clues that these things were going to happen, and they simply were not interested in the terrorist threat. I mean, I think that, frankly, is a true statement, alas. And so they did indeed deserve some blame. There's no question about it.
Let me mention two things that we're not going to be able to spend much time on, but I commend people to the book Spiral for an excellent and pretty in-depth handling of. One is torture, and you go into some, it was certainly an issue you were on top of at the time, and in this book you have the sort of the benefit of hindsight, kind of, to look at how it evolved, why we did it, how ineffective it was. One thing I will just throw out to people is you point out that, and this stuns me actually, is that there's no evidence that anyone in the Bush administration did any research on either how we had done effective interrogations in World War II or how Britain, France, Israel, who've dealt with terrorism for years in various locations, had dealt with interrogation, that they just absolutely made it up on the fly as if no one had ever faced this problem before. And as I said, I don't think we have time to really go into that, but if you want to say something sort of briefly about the torture issue.
No, it's remarkable, and I think the main point to make here is that they didn't arrive at the idea of using torture through a method of investigation of what would work and what wouldn't. They arrived at it as a kind of show of commitment, a political show of commitment. Like, we're willing to do anything to stop another attack. And, you know, it really was a top-down decision, not a bottom-up, although they tried to persuade people that interrogators on the scene needed these techniques and asked for it. But in fact, that's not what happened. That's not what the record shows. And the degree, you know, the sort of vacuous way they arrived at this really consequential decision still is rather shocking. And I do describe that at some length in the book.
Right. Then the other thing that I've mentioned that you deal with quite a bit, which we will, because we're going to shift now to what these powers and these precedents in the hand of Trump might mean. But the other thing that you deal with a good deal is Obama's positions, statements, and there's many of them. I found myself, you know, jotting down, wow, that really, if he had done or even attempted to do what he said he believed, things would be very different. But in fact, you make a very clear outline that what he did was he sort of normalized by that initial decision. We look forward rather than backward. He normalized what had happened, and then actually he developed the light footprint strategy, the drones and the coverts. He crafted this hybrid criminal justice military approach. What he did basic and was harder on whistleblowers than Bush had been, he created a playbook and a normalization of what had gone before, and now that is handed off. He may have thought he was going to hand it off to Hillary, but he handed it off to Donald Trump. So I commend people for that as well. Let's talk about Trump. You did some reporting on Trump, which was not in his rise in the primaries and so on, which was not specifically dealing with torture or the Middle East or terrorism, but just with the phenomenon. If I were to say we've got 5 minutes left, what's your biggest fear about the war on terror in the hands of Donald Trump?
Well, my biggest fear is that there'll be a crisis, perhaps a successful domestic attack, and that he will use it to assume extraordinary powers even greater than the ones he already has, which have been bequeathed to him by, as you say, by Obama. And he will manipulate that crisis to his own political advantage. I think if something like that happened, if you had a successful domestic attack, I think he would seize on it. I think he's shown his proclivity for doing that already during the campaign, where when there were, the Orlando attack and the San Bernardino attack, both of them he tried to use. And in fact, the San Bernardino attack he rose perhaps 7 to 8% on average in the polls after that attack. He used it quite effectively, and he's very much aware that the profile of a strong leader gains after an attack. So that's my greatest fear. I mean, but even as we sit here, he has significantly changed the war on terror. I mean, the number of bombing attacks in Syria and Iraq is raised significantly under Donald Trump. The number of civilian casualties is way up, dramatically up. And even though they deny that they've changed the rules of engagement, in fact, there has to be some reason why these bombing attacks are killing many more civilians than were being killed during the Obama administration. there's been a relative paucity of attention about this.
Absolutely.
I mean, yeah, a few articles here and there in the Washington Post, New York Times, but in fact, under the war on terror currently, the United States is killing a lot more civilians, probably half again or more. These numbers are very difficult to come by, but significantly more civilians in the bombing attacks on Iraq and Syria. And he has delegated, forget about rules of engagement, he has delegated decisions on specific attacks to the military, where Obama used to closely scrutinize plans in which civilian lives would be risked. Trump has essentially said, it's up to you guys. It's up to the Pentagon. Let them do what they want. He's essentially let them know he will support them and, go in harder, go in stronger, go in more dramatically. And that's basically what they've been doing. So the second risk, after the risk of a crisis, the second risk is that these wars will escalate and no one will really pay attention, which is basically what's happening as we sit here talking.
I see. And in other words, escalate, the very fact that more people are dying and we are being more aggressive is an escalation, and it rates less attention than whatever his latest tweet was.
That's right. And, the reason Obama focused on the light footprint and at the same time reducing civilian casualties, even though they killed a lot of civilians, was a very practical military reason, the military political reason, which is that the more civilians you kill, the more jihadists you create. That's a fairly simple formula. And Trump essentially, so far as we can tell, doesn't really believe that. He is the candidate who described his policy during the Republican primaries as bombing the shit out of them.
That's right.
That's what he said. And,
is he the one that said the sands would glow?
No, that was Ted Cruz.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. As you point out, we had just a really high level of discussion during the Republican primaries about what to do.
Yes,
Cruz was talking about bombing until the sand glowed, and Trump was talking about bombing the shit out of them. But,
all channeling their inner Dick Cheney.
Exactly. Although Cheney was more circumspect in his language usually.
Yeah.
And Rumsfeld, compared to these people, was a very thoughtful Secretary of Defense who understood the risk with civilian casualties relative to the people in power now, who simply think the more bombs you drop, the better off you are. They really, as far as I can tell, have simply no grasp of the basic dynamics of, attacking jihadism and, the risks of creating more jihadists the more bombs you drop. There's simply, that understanding may indeed exist among Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, and his immediate entourage, but it doesn't seem to exist in the White House.
Right. And the last thing I will mention, and then we've got to close, is you also point out, as others have, that in some of your writings in the New York Review, that his attacks on the judiciary, on the travel ban and other things, so-called judges, etc., his repeated attacks on the judiciary and the press mean that, going back to your first point, if there were a crisis and he takes very dangerous escalatory actions, he has already said, don't listen to those judges if they try to reel me in.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think he's kind of set the predicate, as the lawyers say. He's already established that, in fact, he said it in tweets.
That's right.
That if there's an attack, we'll blame the judges.
Yep.
And believe me, judges, when it comes to national security matters like this, are extremely hesitant to interfere with the executive, even though we're talking about an immigration decision, after all. But they're extremely sensitive to criticism that they've taken over the prerogatives in national security that rightfully should belong to the president. So I think that if you had a successful attack, and if he launched a verbal attack on the judiciary and on Democrats in that situation, I think it would be very effective politically.
Okay.
He's very cunning. He's very cunning.
We've got to close it at there. So again, the website is Mark Danner, DANNER, Mark with a K, MARKDANNER.com. The book is Spiral, Trapped in the Forever War. Thank you, Mark Danner. Keep up the good work.
My pleasure, Terry. Thanks for having me.
Okay. So for this conversation and many other interviews, articles, transcripts of interviews, and to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to TerrenceMcNally.net or aworldthatjustmightwork.com to the same website. If you want to receive my weekly email announcements of upcoming guests and issues, sign up at my site or email me at temcnally@mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to the Freeform podcast on iTunes. You can find years of podcasts at my site, TerrenceMcNally.net, or at iTunes. Listen anytime, anywhere. Thanks to G, my engineer, Mark Maxwell in production, and George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices. And most of all to you, my listeners, please share this podcast widely.